This is episode 77 with Professor J. Norman Baldwin.
Welcome to the Quarter Life Comeback Podcast, the show that empowers you to become the hero of your life's journey. With your host, Brian Tier.
Leadership isn't necessarily where it's at. What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Quarter Life Comeback Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Brian Tier, and those were the wise yet controversial words of this week's guest, Professor J. Norman Baldwin. Now, before we get into the show, a quick shout out to our sponsor. Again, it's Rooster. Rooster is the awesome alarm clock app that allows you to wake up to pretty much whatever you want, whether that's voice notes from friends and family, inspirational messages, sports news, world news headlines, or anything else really. And I've also got a channel on there, so you can check out that and wake up to me if you really like. So make sure you head on over to the various app stores, whether that's on the Google Play Store or the iStore, and go check it out. That's Rooster. Now, on to today's episode, and J. Norman Baldwin is a professor of political science at the University of Alabama, where he served as the director of graduate programs, undergrad programs, and the master of the public administration program. Despite having leadership skills stuffed into every business course he taught, Professor Baldwin discovered that most of his students didn't want to be leaders, and for the few who did, it would be years before they could use any of what he was teaching anyway. The truth is, the vast majority of students enter the workforce as entry-level employees and not as leaders. In our fast-paced competitive society, leaders get all the glory. There are conferences and courses you can take and hundreds of books you can read on how to be a leader, how to be a better leader, why everyone should strive for leadership. But leadership just isn't for everyone. In fact, the majority of the roles we fill in our lifetime are those of a follower, which is why it's a little strange that there's this desperate shortage of material teaching us how to be a good one. Professor Baldwin tackles that area of need in his new book, Winning at Following: Secrets to Success in Supporting Roles, where he also addresses the harmful myth that being a follower equates to a lack of success or satisfaction. Now, this episode is packed with goodness, and in it, you're going to learn why we're not all meant to be leaders, why we've become obsessed with leadership versus supporting roles, what to do if you don't feel fulfilled in your job, the critical ingredients for finding job satisfaction, what research shows are the best and worst jobs out there, is it possible to be a follower and still make an impact, the top 3 qualities of all great followers, and how to find an employer that fits your followership style. As I said, packed with goodness, and you can find all the links and resources we mentioned at the show notes, which are at briantier.com/077. But for now, guys, I think you're going to enjoy this one. Let's go hang out with Professor Baldwin. Welcome back, everyone, and a big welcome to today's guest. I'm speaking to Norman Baldwin. Norman, welcome to the Quarter Life Comeback.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
And I think I got the last name spot on. I'm excited to be speaking to you. Brianna reached out with this topic, like I mentioned before we went on the call. And it's something that I never really gave much thought to beforehand. But after seeing the email and your book, it's really fascinated me. So I'm excited to get into it. But before we get into that, why don't you tell people listening a bit about who you are and your story, your kind of quarter life story?
Well, I just retired as of August 1st. I've been a university professor for 36 years, and I've taught courses on how to lead, manage, and organize people for public service. A lot of what I teach is generic management, but then I teach it also with an angle of preparing people to work in charitable organizations and governmental organizations, and lived in 7 different states. My father was a professor, and I'm finding retirement is just as busy as working full time.
Amazing. Now, the topic that we're going to speak to you about today is, you mentioned leadership and that kind of thing. But actually what we're going to speak about is followership. And you said that, we're not all meant to be leaders and that some of us are followers and not leaders. I wonder if you could just speak to us about that a bit more.
Well, what is interesting is that most people don't want to be leaders, especially in the formal sense. And it's interesting. I was always confused that my father never wanted to be a leader in terms of being a dean or university vice president, university president. He loved the laboratory. He was a microbiologist. And so many of the most interesting jobs are at the grassroots level. Interacting with people and really seeing a significant impact on the lives of people. And so people just in general know that leadership isn't necessarily where it's at, and it's also not consistent with certain people's personalities. You have to have very diverse interest and a high tolerance for stress to be, especially in high leadership positions. But, all of us are followers too. Even leaders are still followers. And we just don't write enough and talk about enough about followership.
Yeah, that's amazing. And as you're explaining it kind of feels the same to me as how there's, nowadays there's such a drive to become an entrepreneur and to go out on your own and start your own business. But there's nothing wrong with like working in a corporate job for a company without going out on your own. But it seems like there's this societal pressure nowadays to, become an entrepreneur. And I guess that's kind of analogous with becoming a leader. But why do you think, society and that kind of thing has become so obsessed with being a leader versus serving in a supporting role?
Well, I think it's easier for people to understand leadership than to understand the true complexity of organizations, what really makes organizations work. And we have this romanticized vision of leadership. And as long as we think about these things simply, it's easier to attribute success and failure to leaders versus the complex interactions of myriads of variables going on in organizations. But we're always fascinated by leaders. We're fascinated by what makes them enormously successful and what makes them enormously failures. So, but it's much more simple-minded thinking than the way we're taught to think in academia about what brings about success in organization and failure in organizations.
Yeah, and what's interesting is you mentioned how most of the literature is on how to become a better leader. When you said earlier that most people don't want to become leaders, why do you think there's that kind of what's the word I'm looking for? That kind of the discrepancy of most people don't want to become leaders, but most of the literature and things we find is on how to become a better leader.
Well, I guess again it's kind of simplistic thinking, and plus reading and studying about famous leaders is fascinating. It captures our imagination. And it's just simpler to think in terms of a leader bringing about the success or failure of organizations. But yeah, and what is fascinating is that most of the management literature is all aimed at leaders, when most people are going to, especially young in their careers and the type of audience that you appeal to, when most of them, especially in the short run, are going to be followers. And then some are just going to find that they don't want to be leaders because the grassroots level jobs are interesting. It's just like, would you rather run the radio station or be doing your show? And I suspect you'd rather be doing your show than running the radio station.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny because I think a lot of people, obviously the show is centered on the quarter life crisis. And I think a lot of people feel stressed out when they're in the start of their job. Like, this isn't what I signed up for. This isn't what I had in mind. When I think that could be because there's so much pressure to become a leader as fast as possible. And actually, like, if that happens, they might find, well, actually, those early days were the things that I really enjoyed, and being a leader is not cut out to, not all that it's cut out to be.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, young people so oftentimes are put in a position where they have to just take the first jobs that are offered to them. And I think it's perfectly natural to float around, especially in the early years of your employment, till you find something that you really enjoy. And it's, once you find that grassroots job that you really enjoy, it reaches the point where it becomes kind of ridiculous to try to move up the ladder when you, for example, enjoy working with a certain clientele or on certain types of projects that you'd be removed from if you climbed the ladder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I always love speaking to, guests with a little more experience and slightly older. I'd love to hear, what would your advice be to people in the beginning of their careers now who maybe don't feel quite so fulfilled in their position?
Well, yeah, basically half of my book is actually more than half of my book is about followers find satisfaction at work, finding the right jobs. And so what I present is a lot of research on what brings about satisfaction and job satisfaction. It's a matter of basically essentially looking for those jobs that basically incorporate several of the leading characteristics that lots and lots and lots of studies have shown are important characteristics. Right at the top of the line is essentially finding a well-designed job. And when we talk about a well-designed job, we're talking about a job that gives you autonomy, independence, discretion, that has meaningful work, that allows you to exercise a variety of skills, et cetera. But we also, encourage, young people essentially to only look at organizations that have what we call are very just, fair work environments, where essentially the decision-making processes are fair and the outcomes of decisions that are reached bring about fair allocations, fair pay raises, fair allocation of resources, et cetera. And then we also talk essentially about finding satisfaction basically through what we call management behaving with integrity. And all these are from research findings. So you look for organizations where management is true to their word, what they say is what they do, and they're true to the principles and values of their organizations. But those are the kind of the top three factors that research say that young people should be looking for in jobs. In turn, there are some factors that are bad factors that bring about job dissatisfaction that people should be looking at and discerning before they work for certain organizations. And in particular, people need to steer clear of organizations that have a lot of what we call organization politics, or basically what we're talking about here is kind of the selfish scheming and plotting of employees outside the formal structure of the organization. And they should avoid jobs where there's role stress. Role stress is where, unfortunately, you can be put in a position where you're serving two masters or have role conflict, where you have your immediate bosses pushing for high productivity, and you may have, let's say, HR or the legal department putting a lot of pressure on you to follow all sorts of rules and regulations that cuts back on your productivity. But also, employees don't like role ambiguity, where it's unclear what you need to be doing in your job. And finally, we encourage people to steer clear of organizations with any reputation for breaching their contracts, contracts dealing with what they're going to pay you, workloads, delivery of service materials, et cetera. So, yeah, it's just very important that you look towards organizations that are well run and you avoid those that have problems. And sometimes you have to get in there to find out they have these problems. Sometimes you have to get into the organization to see that they have these good things. But people really need to do their homework before they take certain jobs.
Yeah, amazing. And this is already going to be so valuable for people listening. So I urge people to rewind if you have to and listen to that part again if you are thinking of, finding new work or finding your first job.
Right.
Let's say someone is in a job that they're unhappy with. Do you recommend that they kind of secure work first before kind of quitting and jumping ship? Or should they just go, if they're unhappy, just go all in and quit and then find something?
Oh, I think the former. Yeah. Basically, given the amount of debt that people take on, the obligations to spouses and families and all, I would not jump ship until I found another job. Unless things are just so horrible that, something really very negative in your life is going to happen if you don't quit in terms of a nervous breakdown or whatever. But I would say most of the time it's just incredibly smart to find another job before you move on. You don't want to yourself your income.
Yeah, when I quit my job 3 years ago now, I quit with no plan B, and it sounds really romantic and that kind of thing, but I can assure people now, I actually recommend people, same as you, don't do that, because it does create a lot more stress down the line. And you lose out on the benefits. No matter how unfulfilling your job would have been, you're still getting really good benefits compared to if you're unemployed for a certain amount of time.
Right.
And
But it's okay to fantasize about just walking out of your job and disappearing. I think we all have those fantasies.
Yeah. And you mentioned something that I think is really important earlier is you said, you've got to find the job that kind of fits and that meets those criteria. But sometimes the only way to find that is to be in one of the bad jobs. And I think that's really valuable because people are so scared of taking a job if it's not going to be the thing or like the right match. But sometimes you just have to take action and see what comes of it and then plot your course after that.
Well, I agree 100%. And the thing that's fascinating is there's all this research on the best and the worst jobs, and I pulled that together and was pretty amazed at what really popular jobs are in terms of being interesting jobs, paying well, offer job security, etc. And there's some jobs out there that just surprise you. Clearly, engineering jobs are at the very top of the list in terms of being fulfilling jobs that pay well, don't make you travel up too much, etc. Jobs as financial advisors and planners and computer systems analysts are right there at the top. I realize those jobs sound kind of technical, and some people may not feel that they're really inclined to something that's more technical, but I really think people ought to give these jobs a chance. And, students, especially that are preparing for their first career, need to explore some courses in these areas to see if actually it's more interesting than what they think. And I think, for example, people hated algebra and trigonometry in high school doesn't mean that they're going to hate financial planning and a finance major in college. Same thing with engineering. Gosh, when you get to really apply the mathematics and all to something that is very constructive, people, I think may enjoy something that's more technical than they realize. But there's some other jobs that I was just shocked to find are very popular jobs that don't sound very interesting that will rank in like the top 10 jobs. And one is a dental hygienist, another is an actuary, and another is a pharmacist. I never would have guessed that those were great jobs, but they actually get evaluated very highly.
It's really interesting. And yeah, I'll definitely link up the book in the show notes so people can go and read it and see some more of those jobs. Do you think... Yeah, go ahead.
Then you've got the bad jobs, too, and we can talk about that if you want. There are jobs that seem to be very appealing that actually are not very...
Yeah, let's mention some of those.
Yeah, the thing, there are certain things that just make sense, like a garbage collector's job is clearly a very low-ranking job, and a lumberjack and, a fast food cook. But believe it or not, jobs as police officer, as a disc jockey, as an enlisted military person, be all that you can be, I guess is not all that you can be in a newspaper reporter. And here's one that's going to surprise you. A broadcaster's job is actually ranked pretty low. Now, what's going on with all of these jobs is that they typically don't pay very well. It's like a police officer job doesn't pay well. The hours are bad and the work is dangerous. And something like broadcasting, and maybe you haven't experienced this, but especially young people that are able to break it into broadcasting, they get into small stations, small networks where they're having to both write the news and present the news. And again, they're working bad hours. They're working at night. They're working on weekends. And there's always somebody looking over their shoulder, wanting their job, wanting to be in front of the camera. So it's just very interesting. What seems to be popular that we kind of romanticize and fantasize about, and what are actually good jobs.
Yeah, I'd love to find out from you, what is your view or your take on the whole, follow your purpose and that kind of thing? The reason I ask is you mentioned, let's use the police officer, for example. Like someone might feel that their purpose is to uphold justice and that kind of thing. Where do you think purpose and passion fits in?
Well, the bottom line is this. In this book that I've written, Winning at Following, what I do, I bring the research together, but one of the things I emphasize, these are generalities, and that any one work environment or any one job may be the perfect fit for you, even though it may not be on my list of highly ranked jobs. And so, yeah, you do pursue your passions. And, I can give any number of examples of people that are in jobs that may not pay well, but it's just a perfect fit because they were meant to be a newspaper reporter. They were meant to be a police officer. So I am huge on people pursuing intrinsically satisfying jobs that reflect their passion.
Yeah, I agree. I've always emphasized too that, there's a big, again, like on social media and everywhere else we kind of follow today, there's this big drive towards like, be your own boss and that kind of thing. And I've often emphasized that there's nothing wrong with doing a 9-to-5 job if that's what you feel called to do. Like for some people, they might feel called to be a lawyer or an accountant. And in that case, why should they try and be their own boss? So I'm glad you brought that up.
Well, it's interesting. I'll give you a couple of quick examples. Actually, a lawyer's job is kind of a very average ranking job, but everybody wants to go into law school, but they really don't think through this. And I have a nephew, basically, that went on to law school and started working in a law firm and just said, I can't do this. I want to be a football coach. And so he quit his job in a law firm to start at the very bottom as a graduate assistant at the University of Georgia to be a football coach, and basically climbed to the pinnacle where he became the head coach of the University of Tennessee. Now, that was a CEO type of job. That didn't work out for him. Needless to say, you have great buyouts when you're a football coach. He never needed to work another day of his life after he got his buyout, but he immediately took another job as a receiver coach of the Dallas Cowboys because he loves to coach football. Mm-hmm. In turn, there was an All-American quarterback at the University of Alabama by the name of Stedman Shealy. And Stedman's just the opposite of my nephew. He started coaching and he was going to play in the Canadian Football League, and he felt called and moved to be an attorney. So it's kind of like, it doesn't matter that I was an All-American and led the University of Alabama to a national championship. I've got to be an attorney.
Yeah, that's amazing.
It is. It's very fascinating.
I want to ask, is it possible then to be a follower and still make a big impact?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like as a professor in the classroom, I think, I hate to say it, I have a bigger impact on the lives of individual students than somebody that's a dean or a vice president. Now, I may get in trouble for saying that, but at a minimum, I'm having that connection with students that allows me to see their growth. It gives meaning to my job. And it's the same thing with, a social worker who's out there working with the aged or working with juvenile delinquents or working with people of low income, to the extent they're in the field making a difference. Wow. Mm-hmm. That's very special. And people further up the ladder typically can't see as much direct connection to the change in people's lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess every role in some way is a leadership role and a following role. You could be, as a lecturer or a professor, you could be a leader to the students, but you're a follower to the dean or that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, here's the other thing, Brian, is that you can be a leader in a followership role and you don't have all the responsibilities of the formal leaders. And there are people that don't even recognize they're leaders, but they have power because they're credible, because they're smart, because they exercise good judgment, and people just naturally go along with them. In fact, one of the leading scholars says that let me say, it's a majority of the true leaders in organizations are not in formal leadership positions. I'm trying to find that number. Yeah, the quote is 3/4 of all leaders are not found in the formal management hierarchy.
Yeah, it reminds me of Robin Sharma's The Leader with No Title.
Yeah.
We all able to be leaders in the role that we are right now.
Right. And then,
yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
So I was going to ask, we touched on some qualities there. What are the top qualities of a good follower?
Oh, great. Well, this is a little interesting. I tried to guess them and couldn't guess them. And I gathered all the research, and I guessed that being A, competent, B, responsible, and C, honest. But actually, the three top qualities are being an effective communicator, being active, and being interpersonally skillful. And if you'd like me to kind of tell you what we mean by that, effective communicators are, they're understandable, they're accurate, they're timely, and they're complete but not excessive. The adage that followers to be seen and not heard is just far from the truth. Bosses want to hear from their followers. They want them to be open, speak up, offer opinions. They want them to persuade, etc. When we talk about active followers, most leaders don't want their followers to sit around and wait for directions. They want their followers to be proactive participators, energetic, and initiators. And when it comes to being interpersonally skillful, bosses love subordinates who are socially intelligent. And here we're talking about being diplomatic, being friendly, being interactive, and just being skilled at building networks. But those are the three leading qualities. The three more, if you're curious, are being responsible, being a team player, and being flexible. But the top three really stand out in the literature. They kind of separate out from the top half dozen.
Mm-hmm. And just from your point of view, what is, I know you mentioned communication there as one of the top three. What is one sort of effective communication technique that people could adopt straight away?
Well, straight away, I think they need to speak up, then shut up and listen.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say people need to avoid pejorative language. They need to not use value judgments to talk about things being awful or bad or terrible or insignificant or whatever. It takes real serious practice, and I encourage people to take a course in communication or interpersonal dynamics to learn how to express how you really feel without making value judgments. It's like when I teach my students, I never tell them their work is terrible. I just tell them what to do to improve the work, if that makes sense. And it's difficult, but we're so often inclined to make value judgments when all we want to do is change people's behavior going forward. So we just need to tell people what we want them to do, not that their past behavior is awful or terrible.
That's so important.
And I think in general, people are conflict averse, and we just need to make communication safe. And sometimes in making communication safe, we have to go to alternative methods in face-to-face communication. And that's where, and this is really advice for leaders, they need to use anonymous surveys. Organizations need to have ombudspersons, suggestion boxes, different ways for people to communicate so they, in a way that they can trust the information to get to the right people and not have it held against them because it's anonymous.
Mm-hmm. Are there different types of followers? And if so, how do we tell which kind that we are?
Yeah, there are different types of followers. And there are like active versus passive. There are conformist versus very independent people. There are people that are altruistic versus very self-oriented. And when I write on this, one of the keys is essentially finding out what your followership style is. And I write about that in a book. And Robert Kelly has a test for your followership style. I have a test for your followership style. And then part of the key is basically figuring out where you fit and going to organizations that are compatible with your followership style. And, it's interesting. We can talk about essentially here are the qualities you need to develop to be a great follower. But, some people just can't change. And so when I write on this topic, I'll say, okay, identify your followership style and then go to organizations that are compatible with your followership style. So if you're, for example, a very independent follower, you don't want to go work in an organization that's very hierarchical, that's very top down. In contrast, if you're kind of a conformist and more passive, a more bureaucratic, hierarchical, autocratic organization is fine for you. Mm-hmm. So it's a matter of finding the right fit.
Yeah, it's similar to the advice of like one of my mentors told me, and it's all over personal development literature, but it's like instead of trying to improve your weaknesses, just focus on your strengths. And it's kind of the same thing here.
I think
finding that right fit.
Yeah. We academics challenge everything. I do think, it's smart to focus on your strengths, but I don't think we can ignore our weaknesses either, because some of them are just too dangerous. Mm-hmm. We get us in too much trouble. It's a decent generalization, but as my academic side will do, I'll take exception to that generalization that I don't think we can ignore all our weaknesses.
And I welcome that. Norman, before we wrap up, is there anything you think might be worth mentioning to people listening that we haven't touched on yet?
Well, and I would simply say, don't feel bad if you're in a followership role, and don't feel that there's anything inferior about you because you're in a followership role, especially if you're doing something that you love. And the other thing is I think you can go kind of laughing all the way to a happy life, knowing that you can be a follower and exercise tremendous power without all the demands of leadership. And followers basically don't have to give their employees bad evaluations, don't have to fire employees, don't have to give people bad pay raises, etc. And you can be a leader as a follower without all those ugly responsibilities. But anyway, and the other general thing I simply want to say is that I really think that organizations at this stage in the 21st century will get more bang out of their buck by focusing on followership. And that includes academia than focusing on leadership. So much as there's nothing else in my mind that can be said about leadership that hasn't already been said, but there's still a lot to be written and learned when it comes to followership.
Mm-hmm. And when you say followership, could that also be described as sort of self-leadership?
Yes, I think so. Now you've actually kind of trumped the academic here, but no, I think you're right there.
Right.
But still, the idea is you're subordinate. There may be self-leadership, but you're subordinated to somebody else. But to the extent that you are conscientiously, leading your life in a direction that's going to make you more happy and satisfied and find your life more meaningful, that's terrific. That kind of self-leadership is great.
Yeah, and it's such a relief, this kind of de-stressing feeling when you explain that it's okay to be in a following role. And maybe you don't have to climb all the way to the top of the ladder. You can find your place on it that makes you happy.
Absolutely.
But Norman, just before I wrap up, I do have some quickfire questions at the end. The first one is, what do you wish you'd been told in your 20s?
Oh, good grief. I wish I would have been told to explore the possibility of a career in the military.
All right.
I feel a need to have served. I wish somebody would push that harder, that I would have found a tremendous amount of satisfaction. Golly, I wish I would have been more flexible in where I was willing to work in terms of geography, that I should have gone more to where the great jobs were than trying to stick around my home turf to be with friends and family.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. What do you think is the biggest opportunity for people in their 20s today?
Oh, wow. Well, I guess I've fallen in love with these jobs that are on the highest ranking jobs list here. And I just think people ought to really give second thought to some of these jobs that are a bit more technical. And just because they didn't like their high school algebra or trig doesn't mean they wouldn't love the application of something technical and being an engineer or being a financial analyst or a computer system analyst. Those jobs, people at a minimum need to take a course, take a careful look at some of these jobs before they write them off.
Gotcha. Norman, where can people go to find out more about you and the book and everything else you've got going on?
Yeah, I've got a website that's nbaldwin.people.ua, standing for the University of Alabama.edu, nbaldwin.people.ua.edu. And that will give you a link to another web page that is all about the book. And it has a lot of my charts and data on that web page. So by all means, people need to take a look at that.
Perfect. Yeah, and I'll link up all of that in the show notes so people can find it really easily. Norma, before I get to the final question, I just want to take a second to acknowledge you for not only coming on the show today and sharing your expertise in this topic, but for shedding light on the fact that, there's so much on leadership that, you even mentioned that nothing really more can be said. But now shining the focus on the other people and the majority of people who maybe don't want to be leaders or aren't the right fit for leaders, and kind of, painting the picture that it's okay. And shedding light on this and helping people find their place in the working world. The final question that I do have is, what one thing can listeners do this week to start creating their own quarter life comeback?
Academics, we sit and ponder and reflect. I'd give you a much better answer tomorrow morning after I slept on it. Just be open to new experiences and be willing to ask questions about other people's careers to find out what they do and how much they love the job. And again, just be open. Don't be closed-minded, thinking that certain jobs that maybe have a certain high level of prestige or whatever are going to be the jobs that satisfy you, because the odds are they really won't.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I love it. Norman Baldwin, thank you so much for coming on the Quarter Life Comeback.
Well, thank you, Brian. I've thoroughly enjoyed visiting with you.
So there you have it, guys and girls. That wraps up another episode of the Quarter Life Comeback podcast. And a huge, huge thanks to Professor Baldwin for coming on the show today and sharing so much of his expertise with us. I always love having slightly older guests on. Just creates a bit of a different dynamic and a different viewpoint. And if you loved this one as much as I did, I'd love it if you could share it on social media and shoot me a tweet at Brian Tier to let me know your biggest takeaway. For me, it was the fact that not everyone can, should, or even needs to be a leader, and there's nothing wrong with being in a supporting follower role. And then the other thing that really stood out for me was, identifying your followership style and then picking an employer or a company that suits that style. And you can find out more about that in Professor Baldwin's amazing book, which I'll link up in the show notes, which you can find at briantier.com/077, where I also put all the links and resources we mentioned. And to get more episodes like this as soon as they come out, head on over to quarterlifecomeback.com and subscribe for all that good stuff. And once again, a quick shout out to our sponsor today. It's Rooster, the awesome alarm clock that allows you to wake up to pretty much whatever you choose. Once again, I'm offering coaching if you're interested in taking your performance to the next level. You can find out more about that at briantier.com. But until next week, guys, keep creating your quarter life comeback.